The sun peeked over the horizon, painting St. Peter's Square in hues of gold and crimson. It was a crisp morning, but the air buzzed with anticipation. Thousands of people had gathered from all corners of the globe, their faces glowing with hope, curiosity, and reverence. They were here for one reason: to witness the inauguration of Pope Leo XIV, a man whose rise to the papacy had already captured the world's imagination. Known for his humility, progressive thinking, and deep compassion, he represented a new era for the Catholic Church. This wasn't just another ceremony. It was a moment that would go down in history. Among the sea of pilgrims stood Captain Matteo Rossi, a tall, broad-shouldered man dressed in the iconic blue, red, and yellow uniform of the Swiss Guard. His polished armor gleamed under the rising sun, a symbol of centuries-old tradition and unwavering loyalty. For years, Rossi had dedicated his life to protecting the Vatican and its leaders. He was a man of discipline, someone who believed in following orders without question. Today, however, something felt different, almost electric. The atmosphere was charged, as if everyone knew they were about to witness something extraordinary. Rossi's eyes scanned the crowd methodically, his training kicking in despite the grandeur of the occasion. He had spent months preparing for this day, ensuring every detail was flawless. From the seating arrangements for dignitaries to the exact routes the procession would take, nothing had been left to chance. Yet, even with all the planning, there was an unshakable sense of unpredictability lingering in the air. Perhaps it was the sheer magnitude of the event, or the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. Whatever it was, Rossi couldn't shake the feeling that today might not unfold as expected. As the ceremony began, the square fell silent. The only sounds were the soft rustling of robes and the distant hum of murmurs from the crowd. Cardinals filed into their positions, their crimson attire contrasting sharply against the white marble of St. Peter's Basilica. Then came the Pope, himself walking slowly, his head bowed in prayerful reflection. The sight of him sent ripples of awe through the audience. People crossed themselves, some wiping away tears, while others simply stood in stunned silence. Even Rossi, who prided himself on maintaining composure, felt a lump form in his throat. But amidst the solemnity, something caught Rossi's attention, a flicker of movement near the altar. At first he thought it was a trick of the light, but then he saw her. A young woman, no older than 30, stood where she shouldn't have been. She wore a simple dress, her dark hair tied back in a loose braid. In her hands she clutched a small wooden box, its surface worn and weathered. Her presence was jarring, like a single note out of tune in an otherwise harmonious symphony. Civilians weren't allowed anywhere near the altar during such a sacred event. Who was she? How had she gotten so close? Rossi's mind raced. Was she a threat? Or was she lost, unaware of the gravity of her actions? Protocol dictated that he stay at his post, guarding the perimeter and keeping watch for any signs of danger. But something about her demeanor gave him pause. She wasn't acting aggressively or suspiciously. Instead, she seemed nervous, almost afraid, her eyes darting around as if searching for someone. Despite his training, Rossi found himself torn. Should he ignore her and focus on his duties, trusting that others would handle the situation, or should he act on instinct, breaking protocol to investigate further? The internal struggle played out in mere seconds, but it felt like an eternity. Around him, the ceremony continued uninterrupted. The choir sang hymns, their voices echoing off the ancient stone walls. Incense wafted through the air, filling the square with its sweet, earthy scent. Yet none of it mattered to Rossi in that moment. All he could think about was the woman in the box she held. What was inside it? Why was she here? And why did his gut tell him that whatever was happening was more important than the rules he'd sworn to uphold? As these questions swirled in, his mind, Rossi made a decision, one that would alter the course of the day and perhaps his entire career. Without hesitation, he stepped away from his post and began making his way toward the woman. Gasps rippled through the crowd as they noticed the movement. Never before had anyone seen a member of the Swiss Guard abandon their position during such a pivotal moment. Whispers spread like wildfire. What's happening? Is something wrong? Why is he leaving? For Rossi, the weight of what he was doing hit him with each step he took. Every fiber of his being screamed to turn back, to return to his station and let protocol dictate the outcome. But something stronger, an inexplicable pull, kept him moving forward. As he approached the woman, he locked eyes with her, trying to gauge her intentions. Her grip tightened on the box, but she didn't run or resist when he finally reached her. Instead, she looked up at him with wide, pleading eyes, her voice barely above a whisper as she said, "Please, this is for the Pope." In that instant, Rossi realized two things. First, this wasn't a random intrusion. It was deliberate. Second, whatever was inside that box, it mattered. More than anything else, it mattered. And though he didn't yet know what it contained, he knew one thing for certain: he couldn't ignore it. Not today. Not when the eyes of the world were watching. Captain Matteo Rossi had always been a man of precision and discipline. His life in the Swiss Guard was built on structure, order, and an unshakable commitment to duty. For months leading up to Pope Leo XIV's inauguration, he had poured every ounce of his energy into ensuring that the event would go off without a hitch. Every detail, no matter how small, had been scrutinized and perfected. The seating arrangements for dignitaries were mapped out with military precision. The routes for processions were rehearsed repeatedly until they became second nature. Even the timing of each segment of the ceremony had been calculated down to the minute. Nothing was left to chance, but all of that meticulous planning now felt like it was slipping through his fingers. As Rossi stood frozen at his post outside St. Peter's Basilica, his eyes locked onto the mysterious woman near the altar. She shouldn't have been there. No civilian should have been anywhere near the sacred space during such a momentous occasion. Yet there she was, clutching a small wooden box that seemed to hold secrets far greater than its size suggested. Her presence gnawed at him, creating a conflict within him that he had never experienced before. Rossi's training screamed at him to stay put. Protocol was clear. His role was to guard the perimeter, not to intervene unless there was an immediate threat. He had taken an oath to uphold the traditions of the Swiss Guard, to protect the Vatican and its leaders with unwavering loyalty. Abandoning his post was unthinkable, a violation of everything he believed in. But as he watched her, something deep inside told him that this wasn't just a random intrusion. There was purpose in her actions, urgency in her stance. And then, there was the box. What could it possibly contain? A weapon? A message? Whatever it was, it had brought her here, to the heart of the Catholic Church on one of the most significant days in recent history. The tension between duty and instinct tore at him. Time seemed to slow as he weighed his options. If he stayed where he was, someone else might notice the woman and deal with the situation. Perhaps security personnel stationed closer to the altar would step in. But what if they didn't? What if she was overlooked, or worse, dismissed as harmless? Something about her demeanor told him she wasn't dangerous, but that didn't mean her intentions weren't critical. He couldn't shake the feeling that this moment, this seemingly insignificant deviation from the plan, could ripple outward and change everything. His mind raced back to the countless hours he had spent preparing for this day. He had memorized emergency procedures, practiced crowd control scenarios, and drilled responses to potential threats. Never once had any of those exercises prepared him for something like this. This wasn't a textbook scenario. It was human, unpredictable, and the weight of responsibility pressed down on him, heavier than his ceremonial armor. If he made the wrong choice, the consequences could be catastrophic. But if he did nothing and later discovered that he could have prevented a disaster, how would he live with himself? As the seconds ticked by, Rossi's internal battle intensified. Around him, the ceremony continued, oblivious to the turmoil brewing in his mind. The choir's voices soared, filling the square with hymns of praise. Cardinals moved gracefully in their crimson robes, their movements synchronized and deliberate. Pope Leo XIV stood at the center of it all, radiating calm and humility as he prepared to address the world. It was a scene of beauty and reverence, yet Rossi felt completely detached from it. All he could focus on was the woman in the box. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Rossi made his decision. He couldn't stand idly by and hope someone else would handle the situation. Whatever was happening, it required action, not hesitation. Taking a deep breath, he stepped forward, leaving his post behind. The moment his foot crossed the invisible boundary of his designated area, a wave of unease washed over him. He knew he was breaking protocol, shattering centuries of tradition in a single act. But he also knew that sometimes rules existed to be bent or even broken for the greater good. As he approached the woman, whispers rippled through the crowd. People turned their heads, craning their necks to see what was happening. Some pointed. Others murmured in confusion. Gasps echoed across the square as spectators realized what was unfolding. A member of the Swiss Guard had abandoned his position during the Papal Inauguration. It was unprecedented, shocking, and utterly baffling. For a brief moment, the solemnity of the ceremony was disrupted, replaced by a collective sense of disbelief. When Rossi reached the woman, he stopped a few feet away, his hand resting lightly on the hilt of his sword, a gesture meant to reassure both her and the crowd that he was in control. Up close, she looked even more fragile than he had initially thought. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched the box, her knuckles white from the effort. Her eyes, wide and filled with emotion, met his. She didn't speak immediately, as if unsure whether he was friend or foe. Then, after a long pause, she whispered, "This is for the Pope." Her voice was soft but urgent, carrying a weight that belied her simple words. Rossi hesitated for a fraction of a second before extending his hand. "Give it to me," he said firmly, but gently. Without argument, she handed him the box. It was lighter than he expected, its surface rough and worn from years of use. There were no markings on it, nothing to indicate its origin or contents. Yet, as he held it in his hands, he felt a strange sense of significance. This wasn't just an ordinary object. It was a vessel of something far more profound. For a fleeting moment, Rossi considered opening the box right then and there. Curiosity burned within him, urging him to uncover its secrets. But he quickly pushed the thought aside. Whatever was inside, it wasn't meant for him. It was meant for the Pope. His role was simply to ensure it reached its intended recipient. With renewed determination, he turned back toward the altar, the box clutched tightly in his grasp. The crowd's murmurs grew louder as they watched him move, their confusion giving way to speculation. Who was the woman? What was in the box? Why had a member of the Swiss Guard intervened so dramatically? Despite the chaos swirling around him, Rossi focused solely on the task at hand. Each step he took felt heavier than the last, not because of the physical burden of the box, but because of the enormity of what he was doing. He was walking into uncharted territory, stepping outside the boundaries of protocol and tradition, in a way that could define or destroy his career. But in that moment, none of that mattered. All that mattered was delivering the message, whatever it might be, to Pope Leo XIV, because sometimes the hardest choices are the ones that truly test our character, and Rossi was determined to prove that his character was unshakable. As Captain Matteo Rossi approached the altar with the wooden box in hand, the murmurs in St. Peter's Square grew louder, rippling through the crowd like waves crashing against a shore. People craned their necks, trying to catch a glimpse of what was happening. Some pointed, others whispered feverishly to their neighbors. The ceremony, which had been proceeding flawlessly just moments before, now seemed secondary to the unfolding drama. For the first time in living memory, a member of the Swiss Guard had broken protocol during one of the most sacred events in the Catholic Church, a papal inauguration. It was unprecedented, shocking, and utterly captivating. Rossi felt every pair of eyes on him as he walked toward Pope Leo XIV. His boots clicked against the stone floor, each step echoing loudly in the otherwise silent square. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, not just the physical weight of the box in his hands, but the symbolic burden of what he was doing. He could feel the disapproving glares of Vatican officials piercing into him from the sidelines. They were likely furious, their minds racing with questions. Who gave him permission to leave his post? What was so important that it warranted interrupting the Pope during such a solemn occasion? Yet despite the mounting pressure, Rossi kept moving forward, his resolve unwavering. When he finally reached the altar, he paused for a brief moment, bowing his head respectfully before addressing the Pope. "Your Holiness," he began, his voice steady but tinged with urgency. "A woman entrusted me with this. She said it is for you." He extended the box toward Pope Leo XIV, who looked up from his prayers with an expression of mild surprise. The Pope's face softened as he took in the scene. The nervous guard, the murmuring crowd, the mysterious wooden box. Without hesitation, he accepted it, his hands gentle yet firm as they closed around the object. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The world outside the basilica faded away, leaving only the three figures at the center of the drama: Rossi, the Pope, and the enigmatic box. Pope Leo XIV studied it briefly, turning it over in his hands. Its surface was plain, unadorned, and worn from years of use. There were no markings or indications of its origin, yet something about it radiated importance. Perhaps it was the way the young woman had clutched it so tightly, or perhaps it was the sheer audacity of someone risking everything to deliver it directly to him. Whatever the reason, the Pope understood instinctively that this was no ordinary item. Slowly, carefully, he opened the lid. Inside lay a single sheet of paper, folded neatly and sealed with wax imprinted with symbols unfamiliar to most in the room. The Pope's brow furrowed as he examined the seal, his fingers tracing its intricate design. Then with deliberate care he broke it open and unfolded the letter. As his eyes scanned the contents, his expression shifted subtly but unmistakably. At first there was curiosity, then recognition, and finally a deep sorrow that settled into his features like a shadow. The transformation was subtle, but those closest to him noticed it immediately. Something profound had been revealed. The crowd, unaware of the letter's contents, buzzed with anticipation. What was written inside? Why did it affect the Pope so deeply? Speculation ran wild. Some thought it might be a declaration of faith from a distant community, while others feared it could be a threat or warning. The tension in the air was palpable, almost suffocating. Even the cardinal seated nearby exchanged uneasy glances, unsure how to react. Only Rossi remained still, his gaze fixed firmly on the Pope, waiting for guidance. After what felt like an eternity, Pope Leo XIV looked up. His eyes, usually filled with warmth and compassion, now carried a heaviness that silenced the entire square. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he folded the letter carefully and placed it back inside the box. Then, with a calm authority that commanded attention, he addressed the congregation. "My dear brothers and sisters," he began, his voice resonating across the square. "Today we gather not only to celebrate my inauguration, but also to reaffirm our commitment to serving humanity. In this spirit, I must share with you a message that has reached us, a plea for help from a community in desperate need." The announcement sent shockwaves through the crowd. A collective gasp rose from the pilgrims, followed by murmurs of concern and sympathy. The Pope went on to explain that the letter came from a remote Christian community facing severe persecution. These people had endured unimaginable hardships, violence, oppression, and isolation for years, their cries for assistance largely ignored by the wider world. The letter was a final, desperate attempt to seek aid and solidarity from the Church. It wasn't a demand or a threat, but a heartfelt appeal for support and recognition. As the Pope spoke, tears welled up in the eyes of many in the audience. Some crossed themselves, offering silent prayers for the suffering community. Others held their loved ones close, overwhelmed by the gravity of the situation. Even Rossi, standing quietly beside the altar, felt a lump form in his throat. Hearing the Pope's words confirmed what his instincts had told him earlier. This was no trivial matter. The woman's actions and his decision to intervene had uncovered something far greater than any of them could have anticipated. Behind the scenes, however, chaos erupted. Senior Vatican officials gathered in hushed clusters, their faces etched with frustration and disbelief. How dare a member of the Swiss Guard disrupt such a sacred event? Didn't he understand the implications of his actions? Questions flew back and forth as they debated how to handle the fallout. Some called for immediate disciplinary action against Rossi, arguing that his breach of protocol undermined centuries of tradition. Others, though reluctant to admit it, acknowledged that his intervention had exposed a critical issue that needed addressing. The debate grew heated, with tempers flaring and alliances shifting. Meanwhile, the woman who had delivered the box disappeared without a trace. No one saw her leave, and attempts to locate her proved fruitless. It was as if she had vanished into thin air, leaving behind only the mystery of the letter and the impact of her actions. Her identity remained unknown, fueling even more speculation among the crowd. Was she a messenger sent by the persecuted community, an activist working undercover, or simply a devout believer driven by desperation? Whoever she was, her courage had sparked a chain reaction that would reverberate far beyond the confines of St. Peter's Square. Back at the altar, Pope Leo XIV concluded his impromptu address with a vow to take action. He pledged to send resources, support, and spiritual guidance to the afflicted community, promising that their plight would not go unnoticed or unanswered. The crowd erupted in applause, their cheers mingling with tears of relief and determination. For many, this unexpected turn of events transformed the inauguration from a formal ceremony into a powerful demonstration of faith in action. It was a reminder that the Church's mission extended beyond rituals and traditions. It was about compassion, justice, and standing with those in need. As the ceremony resumed, Rossi returned to his post, his heart heavy with conflicting emotions. On one hand, he felt a sense of vindication. His decision to act on instinct had led to the exposure of a grave injustice, and prompted the Church to respond with love and mercy. On the other hand, he knew he had crossed a line, one that wouldn't be easily forgiven. The road ahead would be fraught with challenges, scrutiny, and possibly punishment. But as he stood there, watching the Pope continue the proceedings with renewed purpose, Rossi couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. Sometimes, breaking the rules wasn't just necessary, it was transformative. And today, amidst the grandeur and unpredictability of St. Peter's Square, he had played a part in something truly extraordinary. In the days following Pope Leo XIV's inauguration, the Vatican buzzed with activity unlike anything it had seen in recent memory. The revelation of the letter from the persecuted Christian community had ignited a firestorm of emotions, both within the Church and across the globe. News outlets reported on the story relentlessly, dissecting every detail of the ceremony and speculating about the mysterious woman who had delivered the wooden box. Social media platforms were flooded with hashtags like Faith in Action and Stand with the Persecuted, as people around the world rallied behind the cause. For many, this unexpected twist at the papal inauguration served as a powerful reminder of the Church's mission to serve humanity, especially its most vulnerable members. But while the public celebrated the Pope's swift response to the plea for help, behind the gilded doors of the Vatican, tension simmered. Senior officials convened in private chambers, their faces grim as they discussed the events that had unfolded. At the center of their debate was Captain Matteo Rossi, the Swiss guard who had broken protocol by leaving his post to deliver the message directly to the Pope. To some, his actions were heroic. To others, they were reckless and unacceptable. The division among the officials was palpable, with tempers flaring and alliances shifting as each side argued passionately for their perspective. On one side were those who believed Rossi deserved commendation. He acted out of conscience, one cardinal insisted during a heated meeting. If he hadn't intervened, we might never have known about the suffering of that community. His decision saved lives. Others nodded in agreement, pointing out that the Church's teachings emphasized compassion over rigid adherence to rules. They argued that Rossi's courage embodied the spirit of faith in action, a lesson worth celebrating rather than punishing. On the other side were the traditionalists, whose voices carried equal weight. "Rules exist for a reason," snapped Monsignor Alberto Moretti, a stern figure known for his strict interpretation of protocol. "The Swiss Guard is not just a ceremonial body, it is a symbol of order and discipline. When one member disregards the rules, it undermines the integrity of the entire institution." He slammed his fist on the table for emphasis, his face flushed with indignation. "What kind of message are we sending if we allow such behavior to go unpunished? Do we want chaos at every future event?" The arguments raged on for hours, with no clear resolution in sight. Meanwhile, outside the walls of the Vatican, public opinion tilted overwhelmingly in Rossi's favor. Stories of his bravery spread rapidly, painting him as a modern-day hero who had risked everything to do what was right. Interviews with eyewitnesses replayed footage of him stepping away from his post, capturing the moment when he approached the mysterious woman. Commentators praised his quick thinking and moral fortitude, calling him a shining example of leadership under pressure. Even some former members of the Swiss Guard spoke out in his defense, arguing that flexibility was sometimes necessary in extraordinary circumstances. Despite the growing support, Rossi himself remained largely silent. In the aftermath of the ceremony, he retreated into solitude, grappling with the weight of what he had done. Though proud of the outcome, he couldn't ignore the potential consequences of his actions. Would he be dismissed from the Swiss Guard, stripped of his rank? Or worse, exiled from the Vatican altogether? These questions haunted him day and night, making it difficult to focus on anything else. Yet even in his darkest moments, he clung to the belief that he had made the right choice. "If I hadn't acted," he confided to a close friend, "I would have spent the rest of my life wondering what might have happened." Amidst the turmoil, Pope Leo XIV emerged as a calming presence. Known for his progressive ideals and compassionate nature, he refused to let the controversy overshadow the greater purpose at hand, aiding the persecuted community. Within days of the inauguration, he announced the formation of a special task force dedicated to addressing their plight. The initiative included financial aid, humanitarian resources, and spiritual support, all aimed at providing immediate relief while working toward long-term solutions. The Pope also called for an international summit, inviting leaders from various faiths and governments to collaborate on protecting religious minorities worldwide. However, the Pope understood that resolving the internal conflict over Rossi's actions was equally important. He summoned the senior officials to a private meeting, where he listened carefully to both sides of the argument. When it was his turn to speak, he did so with characteristic wisdom and grace. "We cannot deny that Captain Rossi broke protocol," he acknowledged, his voice calm but firm. "But we must also recognize that his decision brought us face to face with a truth we could not afford to ignore. Sometimes, following our hearts means bending, or even breaking, the rules. And in this case, doing so allowed us to fulfill our sacred duty to care for those in need." His words struck a chord, softening the stance of even the staunchest traditionalists. Still, the question remained: what should be done about Rossi? After much deliberation, the Pope proposed a compromise. Rather than punishing him, Rossi would instead be reassigned to a new role, one that aligned more closely with the values he had demonstrated during the ceremony. He would lead the newly formed task force, using his skills and experience to coordinate efforts on behalf of the persecuted community. It was a bold move, one that required trust and forgiveness, but it ultimately won the approval of the majority. News of Rossi's reassignment sent shockwaves through the Vatican. Some viewed it as a slap on the wrist, believing that leniency would set a dangerous precedent. Others saw it as a stroke of brilliance, applauding the Pope's ability to turn a crisis into an opportunity. For Rossi, the decision was bittersweet. On one hand, he felt immense gratitude for being given a second chance. On the other, he knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Leading the task force meant navigating complex political landscapes, securing funding, and building partnerships, all while carrying the weight of expectations from both the Vatican and the global community. As the weeks passed, Rossi threw himself into his new role with unwavering determination. He traveled extensively, meeting with representatives from the persecuted community and listening to their stories firsthand. Their resilience inspired him, reinforcing his belief that the sacrifices he had made were worthwhile. Back at the Vatican, he worked tirelessly to rally support for the initiative, leveraging his position to secure resources and raise awareness. Slowly but surely, progress began to take shape. Aid shipments arrived in remote villages, schools reopened their doors, and families found hope in places where despair had once reigned supreme. Yet, despite the successes, challenges persisted. Critics continued to question the legitimacy of Rossi's promotion, accusing him of exploiting the situation for personal gain. Rumors circulated about power struggles within the Vatican, with some alleging that the Pope's decision had created divisions among high-ranking officials. Through it all, Rossi remained steadfast, focusing on the mission rather than the noise surrounding it. "This isn't about me," he often reminded himself. "It's about them, the people who need our help." By the time the first anniversary of Pope Leo XIV's inauguration rolled around, the impact of the task force was undeniable. Thousands of lives had been touched, and the global conversation about religious persecution had shifted dramatically. What had started as a single act of defiance had blossomed into a movement that transcended borders and beliefs. And though the journey had been fraught with obstacles, it had also proven one thing beyond a doubt. Sometimes breaking the rules wasn't just necessary, it was transformative. For Captain Matteo Rossi, the man who had dared to follow his heart, it was a legacy worth fighting for. In the years that followed Pope Leo XIV's inauguration, the story of Captain Matteo Rossi and the mysterious wooden box became more than just a footnote in Vatican history. It evolved into a symbol of courage, compassion, and the enduring power of faith. The events of that day had set off a chain reaction that rippled far beyond the confines of St. Peter's Square, touching lives across continents and reshaping the way the Catholic Church approached its mission to serve humanity. For Rossi, the journey was both transformative and challenging, a testament to the idea that even the smallest acts of bravery can have profound consequences. As leader of the task force created to aid the persecuted Christian community, Rossi threw himself into his work with relentless determination. His days were filled with meetings, negotiations, and travel. He visited remote villages where fear and oppression had long been a way of life, listening intently to the stories of those who had endured unimaginable hardships. Their courage moved him deeply, reinforcing his belief that the sacrifices he had made were worth it. Each face he met, each hand he shook reminded him of why he had stepped away from his post on that fateful morning. It wasn't just about delivering a message. It was about standing up for what was right, even when doing so came at great personal cost. The task force quickly gained momentum, thanks in large part to the unwavering support of Pope Leo XIV. Under the Pope's guidance, the initiative expanded beyond immediate relief efforts to include long-term strategies aimed at fostering resilience and rebuilding communities. Schools reopened, churches were reconstructed, and medical clinics sprang up in areas where access to health care had once been non-existent. These tangible improvements brought hope to places where despair had taken root, proving that collective action could overcome even the darkest of circumstances. For the first time in years, families began to dream again, dreams of safety, stability, and a future free from persecution. Yet, the road to progress was not without its obstacles. Critics continued to question the legitimacy of Rossi's promotion, accusing him of overstepping boundaries and exploiting the situation for personal gain. Some within the Vatican remained skeptical of the task force's effectiveness, arguing that resources should be allocated elsewhere. Rumors swirled about internal power struggles, with some alleging that the Pope's decision to reassign Rossi had created divisions among high-ranking officials. Despite these challenges, Rossi refused to let negativity derail his mission. "This isn't about me," he often reminded himself. "It's about them, the people who need our help." Public opinion, however, remained firmly on Rossi's side. As news of the task force's successes spread, so too did admiration for the man who had risked everything to make it happen. Media outlets hailed him as a modern-day hero, highlighting his leadership and dedication to the cause. Social media campaigns praising his actions garnered millions of views, while grassroots movements inspired by his story sprang up around the world. Even skeptics found it hard to deny the tangible impact of his work. Villages that had once been forgotten were now thriving, their residents empowered to rebuild their lives with dignity and purpose. For Rossi, the outpouring of support was humbling, yet he never allowed himself to become complacent. He knew that true change required sustained effort, not fleeting attention. To ensure the task force's longevity, he worked tirelessly to secure partnerships with international organizations, governments, and private donors. These collaborations not only provided much-needed funding, but also amplified the reach of the initiative, bringing together diverse groups united by a common goal: protecting the vulnerable and promoting peace. Through it all, Rossi remained grounded, drawing strength from the lessons he had learned during his time in the Swiss Guard. Discipline, loyalty, and humility were still the guiding principles of his life, but now they were tempered by a newfound willingness to embrace uncertainty and take risks. One of the most remarkable aspects of Rossi's transformation was how it influenced those around him. His colleagues in the Swiss Guard, once critical of his actions, began to see him in a different light. Many came to admire his courage and conviction, recognizing that sometimes breaking protocol wasn't an act of rebellion, but an expression of deeper values. Young recruits, inspired by his example, approached their duties with renewed purpose, understanding that being a guardian of the Vatican meant more than simply following orders. It meant embodying the spirit of service and sacrifice. Even the senior officials who had initially opposed Rossi softened their stance, acknowledging that his unconventional path had yielded extraordinary results. Pope Leo XIV, too, played a pivotal role in shaping the narrative. In speeches and interviews, he often referenced the events of his inauguration, framing them as a turning point for the Church. "That day taught us an important lesson," he said during a global summit on religious freedom. "Sometimes the rules we cling to are less important than the truths we uncover." When Captain Rossi stepped forward, he reminded us of our duty to listen, to truly hear the cries of those in need. And in doing so, he showed us that faith is not just a set of rituals or traditions, it is a call to action. His words resonated deeply, inspiring countless individuals to reflect on their own roles in creating a more just and compassionate world. By the 5th anniversary of the inauguration, the impact of Rossi's actions was undeniable. The task force had grown into a global movement, with chapters operating in dozens of countries. Thousands of lives had been transformed, and the conversation about religious persecution had shifted dramatically. What had once been a neglected issue was now front and center, sparking debates and driving policy changes at the highest levels. Leaders from various faiths and backgrounds joined forces, united by a shared commitment to protecting human rights and fostering understanding. It was a legacy far greater than anyone could have imagined, a legacy built on the foundation of one man's decision to follow his heart. For Rossi, the journey was bittersweet. On one hand, he felt immense pride in what had been achieved. The sacrifices he had made, the scrutiny, the criticism, the sleepless nights had all been worth it. On the other hand, he knew that the work was far from over. Persecution still existed, hatred still flourished, and there were countless communities waiting for someone to stand with them. But rather than feeling overwhelmed, Rossi felt invigorated. He had discovered a sense of purpose that transcended titles or accolades, a purpose rooted in service and love. When asked about his experience in interviews, Rossi always gave the same simple answer: "I followed my heart, not the handbook." It was a phrase that encapsulated his philosophy perfectly, a reminder that sometimes the greatest acts of courage come from trusting yourself, even when the world expects you to do otherwise. And perhaps that was the most powerful lesson of all, that amidst rigid traditions and unyielding protocols, there is always room for acts of extraordinary humanity. As the sun set over St. Peter's Square one evening, Rossi stood quietly near the altar, reflecting on how far he and the world had come since that unforgettable day. The square was empty now, save for the faint echo of footsteps and the distant toll of church bells. Yet in the silence, he could almost hear the voices of the people whose lives had been changed forever. They were voices of gratitude, resilience, and hope, voices that would continue to inspire him for the rest of his days.